This is Robert Fisher, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
My buddy Dave writes, and I go camping every year, and it's always fascinating to talk to him about nature. He's been on the show before. He's brought some of his friends on the show, and today he's brought another one, Robert, to join us to talk about nature and conservation and how we put all this stuff together. So, Dave, why don't you introduce Robert to us, and let's get started.
Well, I think I'm going to have Robert also introduce himself. I've known Robert for a long time. Worked in different things, and our paths have crossed many times. It's Dr. Robert Fisher. He works for the U.S. Geological Survey, and he's a conservation biologist. But Robert, your background is so extensive, and like we met years and years and years ago when you were still studying, and I don't know if you are officially a herpetologist, but you and I met within the reptile world. And so that's what I always thought you were going to do. But can you give us a little background on what you've done?
Yeah, for sure. So like Dave said, we go back to the 80s, I want to say.
Yeah.
We're a little bit older. And I want to say it was high school that I think I first met Dave. But I've been, pretty driven to kind of work on reptiles and understand reptiles and amphibians kind of my whole life career. And I'm a product of California school system. So I grew up in Southern California, grew up in Orange County, and went to public schools. Then went to UCI, and then I thought the only way you could study animals, you had to be a vet. And so then I learned later you don't have to be a veterinarian to study animals. There's actually researchers that study animals. And so I ended up getting my undergrad at Irvine, and then doing my PhD at UC Davis, studying reptiles and amphibians. I studied salamanders and their declines in the Central Valley of California, and then I studied how species moved around the Pacific Basin, and whether they moved with early humans around the basin or whether they moved on their own independently, how they dispersed using some genetics tools and modeling how people moved, and then did those lizards follow those patterns. And so a lot of my career has been tied to this human dimension. So the work I did in the Central Valley was tied to agricultural development, and ultimately urbanization and the response of vernal pool amphibian communities to those drivers in Central California. While I was doing my PhD in the early 90s, there was this push forward to think about endangered species in a kind of different way. So endangered species have always been viewed as like, you have the bald eagle, so we're going to save the bald eagle. And we have the American alligator. We're going to save the American alligator. We don't think about the American alligator lives in a swamp, and bald eagles feed in swamps, and we're going to save the swamp. So we're going to save the bald eagle and the alligator. We think about those as individual items as we approach recovery for those species, and as we listed them in the past. And so in the early 1990s, while I was a student, Southern California was rapidly developing, and the California gnatcatcher was becoming potentially a listed species, a federally endangered species. And so, like the bald eagle, it was then going to be listed, and its habitat was going to then be constrained in what you could do there. And what we do in Southern California with habitat is we put houses on it typically, or golf courses or malls. And so this threat of listing drove the then governor of California, Pete Wilson, and the Secretary of Interior, Bruce Babbitt, the Building Industry Association, and then other NGOs and partners into some discussions and narrative about how do we think about this landscape in Southern California, where we're not going to stop putting people. That's billions of dollars worth of real estate. We're going to put people here. But if we now have a hard stop on that because of gnatcatcher or other species, what's that going to mean? And so this unlikely kind of consortium came together and said, we're going to try to do multi-species habitat conservation planning. And we're going to go beyond the gnatcatcher and go beyond 3 or 4 year planning cycles. And we're going to try to then take 5,000 square miles of Southern California, including all of Orange County, and then divide that into what's potentially conserved lands and what's going to be take lands, lands that are allowed to be developed and urbanized, and or other uses. And so that planning was kind of the legal framework for that was being done in the early 90s while I was still a student at Davis. And then so I got involved through this Otay Ranch that's in southern San Diego County, which is a giant land grant. And they were moving forward on their development plan kind of independently of this process. And a lot of folks were looking at that plan and what are they wanted to build a new city of 150,000 people on top of gnatcatchers and do this stuff. So there was kind of a lot of political will across the landscape to do something big and different in California as a model forward. And Orange County through the Irvine Ranch was a leader in that. And so like they basically said, we're all in. We're gonna do this, and we're gonna commit our 50,000 acre ranch or whatever it is, to this program and to this process. And so you had different things going on at different times, but it was really interesting to see the kind of the politics of it all work out. And then what's come out of that was this mandate from like 93 to 98 to divide up this landscape, this 55,000 square miles, into conserved and non-conserved lands. So 25 years later, we're still doing land use planning. We're not done. There's still big areas that haven't been conserved yet or planned, but some of the early ones, like in 96, like Dave said, was the Orange County Coastal and Central Reserve. And that was a big win to get that done 25 years ago and to have it as a model for the region. And we have others in Western Riverside County, San Diego County that have been completed for a long time. So I started getting involved when I was still doing a grad student doing something totally different. But then I came to San Diego and worked on my postdoc at UC San Diego. And in that program, like we started writing proposals to study reptiles in this landscape. So as these plans were being developed, we realized we don't know that much about horned lizards. We don't know that much about orange-shouldered whiptails. We don't know that much about certain species. And so then the Department of Interior got congressional dollars to start doing ecological studies on some of those species. And so my actual postdoc was funded through congressional dollars to the University of California to start that research. And then I ended up being hired to continue that research into the U.S. Geological Survey, which is where I work now. So I got hired in 98 as the U.S. Geological Survey, and then I'm still like doing the same thing. But like Dave said, we've built capacity, and we kind of I kind of got hired as a landscape ecologist, and we basically, me and my lab, so I have about 30 people that work for me. We kind of do anything, like we. Not anything, but we do what is needed by the agencies and the building industry and the local jurisdictions to like, what do they need to answer questions so they can make decisions. And so that's what's led us to studying lions in Orange County, bobcats, golden eagles, badgers, study parasites, we study invasives, we study Argentine ants. So like to help ensure the integrity of this kind of program going forward.
I have a question I want to ask, because we had a guy talking about the water wars on the show. We recently talked about lions here in California, and just the other day I was in the Bay Area. I just got back traveling a few hours ago, and I saw two experts on all of our wildfires talking, and polar opposites. Leave the fallen trees, burn, take them out, and it's like, how do these things exist? So you have them, and this is not against anybody. It's for everybody listening. It's not against anybody. But you have environmentalists that are desperate to protect the environment. You have developers that are like, we have to get people off the streets and build homes. You have farmers that are like, this is how we make a living and how we feed the dang nation, right? And we can't seem to like put all these Lego pieces together. Sometimes there's pudding in the Legos, and you're like, so how do we deal with these things? I mean, organizationally, multi-organizationally, to decide we are going to study this species and this biosphere? How do we sort that out accurately when we can't even get people who are PhDs to agree on how fires happen?
Fire is a hot topic for sure.
Yeah.
I think part of it was this. Unfortunately, it is through regulation. Like, people don't volunteer to do something that's going to cost money or be difficult for them, right? So there are these sets of laws. A lot of the environmental laws came in through the Nixon administration, right? Years like the Endangered Species Act and stuff. And so there's agencies tied to implementing those. Myself, we're a research organization. We're totally non-regulatory, and all we do is the science and say, these are like here's the options. Like, if you can make whatever decision you want, you can fight it out in court, but the science says if you do this, you'll get this outcome. If you do this, you get that outcome. And then that's up to everybody else to decide what they want to do, per se. And so in San Diego County, we have this thing called Transnet. So we have SANDAG as our San Diego Association of Governments, and we passed I call it the beer for biology money. And we passed a sales tax in San Diego in 2004, I think, and it was tied to our transportation infrastructure. And everybody needs roads, right? They need to go places. And so as part of that, what we did in San Diego, and again, it was a voter initiative, was said, look, we know roads are going to create environmental conflict. Like, we know that. Like, if you put a road here, there's going to be a problem. So let's do this initiative and build in $200 million for habitat management and monitoring. Let's build in $800 million for acquisitions so we can buy the parcels to do reserve build out. And so let's invest early so that in 10 years, when there's a big fight over this, we don't have a fight. We've already resolved it. We saved the money from having to now go to court for 8 years over whether we're going to do this interchange or not at this place. And we really speed up the process. And so that was kind of the first time, and I'm aware of in Southern California, where we had a big initiative at the county scale that kind of mitigated those conflicts, because the building industry was behind it, because they're like, we don't have to pay now. Somebody, like, the taxpayer, is going to pay, and we'll get the road infrastructure we need to build the houses. And then the environmental groups say we get better conservation because it's earlier. It's not at the last minute when, a coastal acre is worth $10 million. We're going to get that coastal acre for climate change adaptation earlier. So in San Diego, the response to that was, again, a partnership with these different groups to move that forward. And like I said, you pay half-cent sales tax. So there's a tax, but it was a voter tax, not a regulatory tax, let's say. But it helps mitigate the regulatory pressure on everybody, basically.
Yeah, it's funny because we actually have that in Orange County now too. It was a half-cent sales tax. It's called Measure M. It's
right. You have that, right.
Yeah, it administered through the Orange County Transportation Authority, and they've done the same thing. They, when you drive down the freeway and you see a construction project, it's like, this is brought to you by, Measure M, the half-cent sales tax. But part of that is, again, acquisition of properties and trying to make, critical linkages for wildlife movement and all that kind of stuff, as well as habitat restoration. And like we actually have multiple large scale projects of habitat restoration that are funded through the Orange County Transportation Authority through Measure M. And so this model that you're talking about has been expanded in other counties and that kind of stuff. And I think what really has to happen to make these, to kind of going back to Pete's question of how does this happen is, you have laws that are in place, you have environmental groups that are pushing for these things, you have receptive governmental agencies that are like, okay, economically this is going to make sense if we do it up front, then wait till there's major problems, and then all the litigation that comes out of that. And so I think it's a good demonstration of what these have happened over the years. I think in Orange County, you talked a little bit about, in 1996, there was the Natural Communities Conservation Plan that was put in place. And that, again, it was certain laws that were happening. It was, everything from the building industry to the environmental groups. And it was those groups coming together and making some compromises that functioned and pushed, the overall long-term good. And, I like, you talk about the 3 or 4 year planning cycle. In Orange County, they saved with the Natural Communities Conservation Plan, that was a multi-species, save the habitat. It was 37,000 acres in Orange County of wildlands. And most people don't even think there is wildlands in Orange County. You got beaches and Disneyland, and that, we actually have, tens of thousands of acres of wildlands that are protected under these agreements. And that agreement is actually a development permit, and it's a 100-year permit. So it just, some of these things and how they came about are really amazing and kind of monumental. Because if you looked at what was going to happen in Orange County, every time a developer wanted to build, they would run into an endangered species. And there were more and more and more endangered species being added at the growth of Orange County has been massive. It's a massive urbanized area, and it was creating this backlog of economic development in the county, which was actually detrimental to people that lived in the county. So the compromise that came in, and you got to know it wasn't easy. You have developers and you have environmental activists, and they pulled it off. They came in and they came up with a plan, and that, the regulatory authorities of U.S. Fish and Wildlife and California Fish and Wildlife were put into place. And in my opinion, I work on a lot of those lands and I manage a lot of those lands under that Natural Communities Conservation Plan. And it's been very successful here in Orange County. And it sounds like in San Diego, the same has been happening. So Pete, your question of how does this happen? It's complicated and tricky. And ideally, if you get the right people sitting at the table and you get the right support, these things can happen. And the long-term benefits to, obviously the ecological systems and the wildlife and all of that kind of stuff, but also the communities that are adjacent to these, who then, they're recreating in it, they're participating in it with like volunteering to, we have volunteering for monitoring hawk nests. We have volunteers for guided activities. We have volunteers for, doing restoration. We have volunteers who are weeding invasive species and that kind of stuff. So this work and all these people who had been involved in this work has been really, really important and super beneficial, particularly in Orange County, which is not a large county, but from an urbanized population, it's huge. It's 3.5 million people. So, and it's continuing to grow. So I think it's been super important from the ecological standpoint. Robert's team, has done a lot of research, and again, they focus on the research thing. So me as a land manager, I'm like, okay, we have some questions and on decisions we should be making. What about this, and how do we learn about it, and what is the stance of that, and do we need to make management decisions where we're intervening and doing stuff? For example, in Orange County, the western pond turtle is one that, it's the only freshwater turtle on the west coast of the United States. Their populations are tiny in Orange County. And so Robert's team does a lot of work to help us monitor them over time and make decisions on what's happening. And I don't know if you want to touch on that, Robert, about,
I definitely will. And I mean, following on what Dave's saying is that you can see conservation delivery, let's call it, like what went into what is now like for the people, like conservation land, let's call it, that's been delivered. And you look at Orange County and you contrast it to like LA County, where there aren't these kinds of plans, and you can see the most of LA County has the forests and has things that have been in conservation for 100 years or whatever, but you don't see the same conservation delivery except in the Santa Monica Mountains, where the national, the National Park Service is driving conservation acquisitions with the State Park Service and MRCA. But otherwise, the rest of LA County is not got this kind of design, and you can actually see it if you look at Plante Whittier Hills. You can see those hills slowly disappear. Whereas growing up in Orange County, I expected that in the San Joaquin Hills. We expected that in Loma Ridge, and up to Santa Ana's, and we like it was a shocking conservation delivery to have those ridgelines in conservation. You drive in Western Riverside County, they have big conservation pits, but you can just see them eating away on the eastern slope of the Santa Ana Mountains and building houses right up to the forest boundary. And again, you don't necessarily see that in Orange County, and that outcome was really different. And early on, the vice presidents of the Irvine Ranch, we had meetings with those guys, and I would be brought in as an expert on certain species, and they said, I want a golf course here and houses here, and we'd say, well, how about here and here, and just had those kind of fact-based discussions about outcomes. So no, it's really cool. The pond turtle is kind of a sad story. Like growing up, they were in ag ditches in Orange County, and they were. We used to see them when I was a kid. I was like, we used to get them near my house in Tustin, just in these ag ditches. But slowly, the flood control, changed the ag ditches to cement V channels, and then they undergrounded a lot of them, and so the natural biodiversity that was still persisting in these ag fields, even like Tustin Marine Base, slowly was eroding. They weren't great habitats, but they were what was left of some of the swampy areas that were traditionally in the plains, the Tustin's plains there in Orange County. And so turtles slowly were reduced to literally just a handful of spots. And one of the spots is on the coastal reserve that Dave's got management over, and that site is doing amazing, and we have a good population of turtles. And what we're hoping to do is use that site as a nucleus to pull turtles from there to put them back in other places in the reserve. And in some cases, some of those places are unlikely. There are places like small canyons, like Buck Gully and stuff, that were just dry, but because there's so many houses on the landscape and so many people have landscaping, there's now creeks where there didn't used to be creeks. And so we want to lean into that seasonal flow a little bit and say, because of climate adaptation, we have a lot less water in natural areas, but now you've got this weird subsidized flow in places. And so can we lean into some adaptive solutions for some of the species to try to save them and enhance them in that landscape? And so the turtles are an interesting one. Dave doesn't know this, but just this last week, we've been doing, the last month actually, some really aggressive surveys for turtles in other parts of Orange County that are outside of the conservation reserve. But one of them is a OCTA reserve, so it's probably tied to Measure M. Yeah. And we've got maybe the largest populations of pond turtles now in Orange County that we've just recently discovered at a couple of sites. And
that is awesome.
Yeah, it's shocking. And we knew they were there, but we didn't have access because the land was always not in conservation. And so some of these acquisitions are, I think, really going to benefit that species in particular. And some of these places aren't really pretty. They're right along a road, but it's the best we have. And so we're trying to do that. Like I said, working with Dave's team and other teams, we're pretty nimble as far as our research set. So we do monitoring, we do genetics, we do disease, we do a lot of different things. And that's where a lot of stuff that I never would have thought I would work on, like golden eagles. I don't know anything about birds, but I know quite a bit about golden eagles. And at this point, and that was one where, when we even say we work in golden eagles, people don't even believe we have golden eagles down here.
Yeah.
When we talk about badgers, people don't believe there's badgers down here. It's just outside of their realm because they don't think about that. So one of the things we're talking about, I'm bring it back to San Diego just for a sec, is we talk about this quality of life initiative. So Pete, on your point, is we're not talking about saving biodiversity. We're talking about quality of life. We're talking about clean water, clean air, beach sand, things like that people can buy into. Like they want that. Like, I live here, I want quality of life. But to get to that quality of life, that environmental quality of life, that's where doing the right things for biodiversity help you get to those goals. And so some of these funding initiatives tie to quality of life. And that's like Dave's saying, people don't see the wilderness that's behind them, but it's feeding into their quality of life in Orange County.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious because these things are always so big and complex. Again, we have a problem using the water wars as an example, because we're not talking specifically about that. So it's a good proxy. Our actions as humans create new biospheres where species are now active and vibrant and part of this new ecology. So we have these things where whenever we put our foot down somewhere, we change everything. But then we also are so desperate in some cases to build, to harvest, to preserve, that we can't get out of our own way to actually accomplish these things. We have permits in place to lift up the level of dams, but we can't agree on is that ecologically sound. So we can't move forward. And it seems like as a state, we're challenged with this. And then we had a Fish and Game guy on, and he said in his part of Fish and Game, there are 12 of him for the entire state.
Mm-hmm.
And there just aren't enough people. So I'm curious, all the fighting aside, when you look at what you do, Robert, I imagine you could use 5 more of you and still have more work to do than you could possibly ever get done. I mean, you're talking multi-species, that's multi-lifetimes worth of work.
Right. No, for sure. And we work on a thin budget. Most of our money is outside dollars, like Dave's group contributes to some of our programs, and like we're doing work in partnership, and they pay for part of it and we pay for part of it. And that's a lot of it. A lot of it, we work with the military base, with Camp Pendleton, to help them meet their kind of regulatory requirements, and also to help them get ahead of those regulatory requirements. What are the things we see that they could do that would actually get them ahead of what they're worried about or what's on the horizon? And so for sure, I'm time limited in what I can do and participate in. And we haven't, I mean, not that this is much of this isn't meant to be a slur, but a lot of times we say, well, the university should be doing a lot of this work, right? They should be leaders in this. And I've been working on this stuff for decades, and I've not really seen the university stand up and take a leadership role in a lot of ways in some of this. And it's because they don't do that. They educate people. They do specific research questions, and they do training, but they're not the hands on the ground the way we are interacting with those different drivers and those different partners. And so that's where I think a lot of the fallback is. Like, there's so many universities in California, they should be doing this. There's plenty of professors that know a lot about this, and that's 100% true. But the daily stuff, the daily meetings, the daily interactions, the educating elected officials, all that stuff is a lot of time, and it's hard to do. And there's not that many people doing it. And ultimately, like people don't want to like do something harmful, but they don't know what their alternatives are. So if you're the vice president of a company like Irvine Company, and you say, I want to put a golf course here, your staff say, okay, we'll put a golf course there. But you don't really maybe even care. You just want this golf course delivered. And so getting that person educated on why that's a bad area, but this is a better area, is really helps benefit that, because a lot of times the mid-level staff aren't going to have that capacity to talk to that person. So I spent a lot of time talking to different levels of people to educate them on kind of the alternatives to, like what are different ways to soften the impact, let's say, if that makes sense. But definitely could use more of it. I could use more of it. Yeah.
It's funny because we still deal a lot with that, and even you look at in 1996, this Natural Communities Conservation Plan was put in place in Orange County, and it was a big deal. I mean, you had all these elected officials, every elected official that was in Orange County came. You had state level people, you had federal people showing up, you had all these people. It's this big, huge hurrah. And the sad part is you look at 20 plus years later, and you ask an elected official, well, what's the Natural Communities Conservation Plan? And most of them go, what? What'd you say? and there's efforts being done to try to adjust that. There's a Natural Communities Coalition, which is the nonprofit kind of overseer of that Natural Communities Conservation Plan, and they are working on trying to re-engage the community, because it's a 100-year permit, man. They got a long way to go. So
that's the part we've fallen down on, I'd say, Dave, and we've had big discussions about how do we get that institutional memory forward. What's the best way to educate people? Is it a series of podcasts? Is it a book? Is it what's a way to engage people so that the new person that got elected on I'm going to solve homelessness looks at the nature, your reserve, and says, there's where I'm going to solve homelessness. And they just don't know any better, and that's their now platform. And so I think getting that awareness carried forward, that this is a decision the county made, the developer, everybody made, and we've got a 100-year permit, so that everybody sees that and understands that that's not been solved yet, and that's a big one. And we're 25 years into this, and it's not clear how to carry that message forward, especially because there's turnover at every level, at the industries, at the regulators, every level. My conservation organization works for public agencies that we're contracted by them to help them manage the open space that they've agreed to protect. And I will tell you at one of them in particular, who is one of our main partners, we've been working with them for about 12 or 13 years, and we have had at least 11 contract managers. Because because they move on, or they retire, or they, and that's just the one. It happens in every single public agency that we work with, and the elected officials are rolling over every couple of years. And so it's an incredibly challenging situation. We have that challenge, just maintaining, our contracts with these people and letting them know what we're doing for them. But it's like you said, it's at every level, even in the private industry, like the Irvine company, it's the same thing too. There's very few people left who were around in 1996, who agreed to all these things, and not that they actually are still incredibly supportive of what was done. And part of that is because it surrounds their communities, and it surrounds, it's the quality of life for the people that are living in their communities, which is a great thing for the communities. It's a great thing for the people. It's a great thing for the environmental aspect of it. But that is, you're looking at one of the most complicated problems in that long-term, agreements. And then the other thing, at 100 years, what then, what happened?
I will be there, but
we've been waiting 100 years to develop this.
Yes. At some point, that's got to be talked about and thought about, and who knows what the climate will be, politically, or even the climate in general. Or we might lose that battle just from climate change. So,
when I was in college, so I took a geography class at Irvine, and they said that he said, if you look at what we're doing, like we're not informing our decisions, like we're basically cash cropping houses in Orange County. You cash crop it out and then you're done, you just sell out. And he said, but we're doing that on some of the best arable land, the best farming land in the country. And he's like, eventually that we're gonna have to move those houses because we're gonna need that land again. I was like thinking about that as I was driving to school every day from Tustin to Irvine, and watching them build out, on top of orange groves and stuff. And that's the kind of thing that 100 years out, you don't know what we're going to be. What's more important, putting people in apartments and getting those houses back into food, like terrestrial. Like we don't know what we're going to be needing then. So it is a mystery. And that's why these early investments, I think, make the most sense. And, and that's what, Dave's group did. And, the Irvine company did was put most of their land in right early, right on, so that way a lot of these decisions are already kind of sorted out. And I think that's really good. But definitely, it is a complex challenge, and it's very definite. It's like you never know where it's going to go next. Like, what's the next emergency? Is it fires, like you said?
Right now it is.
Yeah, and Pete, like we've been like totally. We weren't studying fire at all when I first started. And then in 2002, we had our first fires up in LA. We started out to study. And then 2003, just all our research went to fires. And we studied fires for a good decade across Southern California, because everybody's like, oh, now conservation isn't being delivered. Now we have to stop houses. And the fire is really, I spent a lot of, before I was doing Eagles, I was doing fire research for a while. And I would walk into a meeting with other fire people and say what I saw based on what we were collecting data on. And people would just tell me I'm totally wrong. Like, you don't understand the system. I'm like, I'm not trying to understand it. I'm just showing you the data. Like these plants are not coming back. Like, that's the data. Yeah. But it was definitely a stressful period, because everybody has opinions on fire. Whether you're a politician or you live in a house in Southern California or whatever, everybody has an opinion on fire. And that's really, it's complex for sure. And now I think there's a big push to kind of look back. Just this morning, we were on a meeting where some of the tribal folks down here are talking about their traditional ways they manage fire on the landscape in Southern California, the Kumeyaay way. And to me, I think there's a lot to this traditional management that we in the last 100 years have washed out of the system, and that we're seeing the aftermath of that in some of these over and over again of big events. But no, it's definitely, every day is a different like drama. It seems like
it is. You probably know that we're heavy in the fire game as well.
Yeah.
And especially in Southern California, where we're a lot of the management techniques that are being done right now are based on forested ecosystems, and that's not what Southern California is. It's a shrubland ecosystem, and it's different. We have too much fire, so doing prescribed burns is like, you gotta study it. We gotta know what's right. And we're also talking about, in Southern California being one of the most biologically diverse places in the world, which is why there's all this attention on conservation in Southern California, because the coastal sage scrub ecosystems are incredibly diverse. They're rivaling things like rainforests and stuff for biodiversity. So that it's super important to focus on those things and keep those those objectives in mind. Let's
Dave,
go.
I want to go past this. You're saying that Southern California is one of the most biodiverse areas in the world. When you drive around, maybe you see some scrub oak, maybe a scrub jay to go with the scrub oak, and some golden grass, but that doesn't jive with what I see out there. Help me understand because that blows me away to hear that. I know I can't be the only person, and I know you've told me this before on our hikes, but it needs expanding before we go further than that.
Robert, you want to take a shot at it?
You're the expert, Robert.
It might be shocking, but it's definitely, where this landscape is a mix, right? Like we have, we're rafting north, right? If you're in Orange County, the land you're on was further south in Mexico. You're part of the Pacific Plate, and you're heading north along, and the San Andreas splits the North American Plate from the Pacific Plate, and you're flying north, at a slow rate, but you're flying north. And so some elements we have are actually things that were in not Central America, but they were in Mexico. They're like the Santa Ana suckers that were in Orange County. They've rafted north from rivers that were further south. And so they've been here maybe 8 million years on this piece of land moving north. So you've got things like that can't get across the desert. A fish can't even get out of the river, right? You can't get across the desert, but they've been rafting. So, and we had a shrimp that was called the Pasadena shrimp, and it lived right where the Rose Bowl is now. It's It's related to one in Northern California, and that lineage of these two freshwater shrimp are 230 million years old. Like, it predates dinosaurs. And so you have things that are like ridiculously old that sat on a landscape forever. And then you have things that got here yesterday, like that are moving up north because of climate change. If we get a big El Nino, we get fish from Mexico that kind of come up the coastline. You get the tuna crabs on the beach. So we have these two really different processes happening. And then we've got a landscape that goes from sea level up to, higher than 10,000 feet, right? So you've got these big gradients. And so you've got parts of really ancient landscape and then parts of kind of recent stuff. And then you've got these, like LA was underwater, 10,000 years ago, because you had the marine incursions and, the sea level change, and all that drives diversity. And so a lot of the places, like we have a really good figure we show, like a lot of the places where we put houses was places that had ag land. And the reason it had ag land, because the ag land was so fertile and it was easy, it was flat and it was rich soil, and it was easy to put houses on that. And the places that don't have houses now, and a lot of the reserves are rock tops. And a lot of those are old ancient pieces, and they're equivalent to old growth forests, like redwoods. They've never been agged. You can't build on them because they're rocks, but they have a lot of holes and cracks, and they have a great amount of diversity that's still living on those patches that persisted across these eons of kind of landscape change in Southern California, climatic change in Southern California. And so this is a statistic you guys can't share. So we're working on this paper right now, so it's a secret, so don't tell anybody. But we put together an estimate, an estimate based on the literature. We put together as many papers as we can on how many new species have been described in Southern California since we started land use planning in 1990. So we did it for the last 30 years, 1990 to 2020. So what's your guess of how many new species from Southern California, just Ventura to the Mexican border?
I'm going to throw 500 out there.
I'm going to double that. I'll take the over and take 1,000.
Wait, so you guys are guessing high, but okay. But it could be that 500 to 1,000 is right. It's just really hard to find the papers. We've got over 400, and so that means when we started planning for conservation in Southern California, we didn't know about those 400 species, right? So we were planning for gnatcatchers. We weren't planning for this weird beetle and this fly and this, whatever, like we those weren't part of it. So that, because it's a biodiversity hotspot, we're continuing to learn about that. And we're looking at how many people does it take to understand that. So we made a map of where all the scientists are that describe species from Southern California. They're not sitting at UCI. They're not sitting at UC Riverside. They're global, because there's so many species that are so poorly known that it takes a confederation of people to figure out how to identify these lichens and whether they have this kind of acid or that kind of acid. And so it's shocking when you really think about what we've learned in the last 30 years while we made a decision on where the future of biodiversity was going to be. Mm-hmm. We made that decision and we're discovering these things. Some of these things are extinct already. They were probably extinct before 1990. But most of them aren't, and most of them, it's just the tip of the iceberg of probably what's here still. Yeah.
It's interesting. We had a large scale restoration site on West Loma Ridge, and so part of the restoration process is you remove all the invasive species, the grasses and the mustard and all that kind of stuff, and you remove that competition. And we had a species of plant called small flowered morning glory that just popped up. It was in the seed bank. We took away the competition. We exposed it to sunlight. And all of a sudden, these things start popping up all over West Loma. And West Loma was grazed pretty heavily and all that kind of stuff. So we're like, what is that? And we finally identify it. Well, turns out it's the largest known population of small flowered morning glories ever discovered in Orange County. And so these things are still out there. They hadn't seen small flowered morning glory in this area in something like 30 or 40 years. And so it actually made international news. And it's this tiny little plant, it's only bunches a little bit with this tiny little flowers. But just just the fact that you can change a couple of things and they show themselves. They're like, I'm here, and I've been here for a long time. I've just been hiding, and I think that that's super important. And Pete, what you're alluding at as you're driving around Orange County and you're on the 5 freeway and you're seeing houses and you're seeing all that kind of stuff. But there, that there are still these open space areas because I've taken you to them, and we've been hiking out, in Santiago Canyon or down by the coast, City Crystal Coast State Park, and this is where all that biodiversity is occurring. And there's through these large planning processes that saved entire ecosystems instead of just one species, the stuff's still there. It's incredibly small, most of it, but it's still there, and it's super diverse, and it's everything from plants to lichens to fungus to the whole gamut, and it's there, and it's actually that's one of the things that I really appreciate about working where I work, because you never know what's going to happen and you never know what you're going to see. And each species is super important to the overall web of everything that's connected. And it's, it's part of the joy of doing this kind of work. And when you're driving down the freeway and you look at you see the Saddleback Mountain and you see the lower foothills, there's a lot there, because even, the 37,000 acres that was preserved under the National Community Conservation Plan was there, and then groups like the Nature Conservancy came in and preserved even more land. And like there was land, almost 3,000 acres donated by the Irvine Company in 2014, which wasn't that long ago, and so stuff's still happening and stuff's still being restored. And through Measure M, the Orange County Transportation Authority has been buying properties in Orange County to preserve them and add them to the system. So all these plans are still in the works. At some point you'll be at a threshold of we've preserved what was available to preserve and the rest has gone to development, but it's still not there. So which is super interesting.
And part of the thing we've been thinking about for a long time is how do you soften development? Like given an alternative at Home Depot, should I buy this plant or this plant? How do you educate people on what to buy? Because there is a lot of science and research on how to make these landscapes more, even the urban landscapes, more permeable. And you can see it in the older landscapes in Orange County. Like growing up, we didn't have coyotes in my parents' house, but now they have coyotes. Like as some of these landscapes built in and there's cover, some of these species have come back even into that urban landscape. And so I think one of the challenges forward is how do you meld that urban to natural interface to make that urban softer and more compatible with some of the native species. And you see it when you go to the desert. You see people have xeriscapes, they have cactus in the yard, but you go to Orange County, you see grass, and it's like, and so it's just kind of it's going to take a while, I think, and continuing to kind of discuss it to get people to have yards that are real butterfly yards, not just invasive butterflies, but actual native butterflies coming into the yard. So I think that's kind of in the future as how to so we'll have a hard line between what you can touch and what you can't touch, but the stuff that where people live, that urban landscape, I think we can do a lot with that as well.
And climate change may push some of that with whole water, all the water issues. If we keep going through massive droughts, the lawns are going to go away. I think you've seen some of that pushes from the water agencies and things like that, where you start planting drought natives and that kind of stuff, and then you start to see some of those species that are currently residing out in the hills or whatever may start to migrate in and start to expand their range and where they're living.
Yeah.
So let's. I want to talk a little bit about two things. Like you mentioned the golden eagles that you had worked on, and I'd love to hear about kind of what were the goals, what questions were you trying to answer, how did you go about doing it, how do you catch a golden eagle, like all that kind of stuff. And then I want to talk a little bit about. I know you guys are working on the red-legged frog projects where you just talked about the rafting north. Well, you're trying to raft them north a lot faster. So those two things, if you could talk about those, I think that would be fascinating.
Yeah, let me start with the eagles. So the eagles, there were people that were working on eagles for a long time in Southern California, and I didn't deal with eagles or any of some of those things initially because they're like hornet's nests worth of kind of research, like fire, like you jump into fire and there's like every opinion. And eagles, same thing. There's eagles all across the country. They're, whatever. But we were asked by the agencies to address some specific questions because some of the science that was being done wasn't really answering those questions and they couldn't make decisions. And most plans had eagles as a covered species. And so for us, as a kind of senior scientist, like, should be able to study anything because they should be able to bring a team together and identify the questions and then go after it. So again, I didn't know anything about eagles, and it was kind of getting the right team together and then having those discussions. And what I learned was, the last real research on them was like published in the 30s and on eagles in Southern California. And then there was some work that was done in the 80s that was like totally relevant to today, but it was never really published. And so we were asked to figure out how many pairs are in Southern California, including Orange County, Riverside, and San Diego. And then what do they do behaviorally? Like, where do they go? So we put these backpacks on them, and I say we put these backpacks on them, but getting an eagle in hand, like I didn't know anything about catching birds or catching eagles. And so I got the best eagle trapper. He lives in Orange County in Tustin still, and his parents.
He lives down the street from me.
Yeah. So Pete Bloom like taught us everything we know. And just as a matter of fact, like he's a guy that caught the last California condor in the wild. They came into captivity. And so he's caught over 800 eagles. And so he trained my team on what to do, how to set up traps, how to get everything ready. And then he would then come out and then trigger the trap and catch the bird. And then show us how to process them and work with him on that. And so our goal initially was to catch between 5 and 10 eagles. That's how much, that's what we thought was a heavy lift. And we've caught over 50 eagles in Southern California. And so we kind of blew past that.
I'm glad.
Yeah, it was not easy. We threw a lot of cows on the landscape, but we used these half calves, these calf cows we cut in half, and we get them from the school milk program. And the school milk program is when kids go back to school in October, they need to have milk for the kids. And so all the farmers in the Inland Empire produce stillborn calves so they can produce milk for the school milk program. And so we then dumped ice chests or freezers at farmers' places so they could save the calves for us so we could use them as eagle bait. So nice. So we littered the landscape with half calves and caught a bunch of birds. And in Orange County, we only caught a few birds. We caught them, on Fremont Ridge. And but the birds in Orange County did some different behaviors than we saw in San Diego birds. And a couple of the birds went north from there through Chino Hills to the San Gabriel Mountains, and then went up to the Sacramento Valley and southern San Joaquin Valley. Some of those birds in Orange County, I think one of them went out to Utah and was living up in Utah for a while. Then it came back to Orange County in the middle of summer, hung out for like 2 to 3 days, and went back to Utah. And so it was really clear that some of these birds, like, they really have a mental map of where they're going. And other birds didn't do that. Other birds just sat on the same spots. We had a female in Orange County that literally just sat around with the nest site in Fremont Canyon. And then she ultimately died in Majeska Canyon. Well, we think that she ate poison rat bait that was put around illegal marijuana groves. Mm-hmm. And so she had high levels of toxin in her system when we found her dead. And we could tell she was dead because the transmitter stopped moving. And so we recovered her and then sent her to the lab. And she's the only bird that had that. And she was not around urban. She was just deep in one of the canyons of the Santa Anas. And so we're pretty confident it was tied to an illegal grow area. But I learned a lot about birds. But what we did was we learned about, we learned how to trap them. but everybody said you can't do these things or birds do this. And I don't know enough about birds to know whether people are right or not. And I said, if I can't read about it, then I'm not going to just believe what you're telling me. So all these things about that they pair up for life and they do this. So we actually have data that shows that these birds are like a telenovela. They pair up and then sometimes they break up and they get a new one comes in and there's just so much drama in the eagle world, and some rock climbers get on a hillside and then they abandon the nest, and then they decide they want to go to another nest and not come back there, and then they chase off that pair. So there's just all this kind of drama we wouldn't have known about if we hadn't actually been tracking the birds. And the technology we were using was this crazy backpacks, these little tiny backpacks, but that work on cell technology, and they were getting data points every 6 to 8 seconds. And so,
wow.
So it's like literally just watching the bird, but in 3 dimensions. And we generated over 9 million movement points for eagles in Southern California over that like 6 year period. It's all three. It's a 3G network, 3 and 4G, but the problem was we're upgrading to a 5G network in Southern California, so my transmitters are going to go offline. So the birds that are sending data, I'm only going to pick up data if they hit a cell tower in Baja that's still on a 4G network or 3G network.
Which they could, right? They could fly to Baja.
Yeah. No, we have birds that went all the way to La Paz. We've had birds that went to Canada, but most of the birds kind of stay around their nest territory. So it's really been shocking and illuminating. And then some things birds don't like to do. Birds hate flying over urban landscapes for the most part. They just won't fly over houses. They really won't. They won't fly over the ocean. Like there are certain rule sets that I can see from the data for the birds, and we have a pretty rich data set that you can see that they surely don't do certain things. And so it's been really interesting. And then now we've got a paper kind of coming up with the estimate for the first time of how many pairs are left in Southern California that are breeding pairs. And we think there's probably about 60. So there's more than 120 birds in the landscape, but there might be as many as 60 pairs across 3 counties, which is encouraging to know. And
it's higher than I expected.
Yeah, it gives us a baseline to kind of move forward with. On the red-legged frogs, let me just jump to that real quick. I don't know how much time we have, and I don't want to.
You're good. Just you're good. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. So on the red-leggeds, that's been a species that when I was growing up in Orange County, I always wanted to see them. Like I would go read the old papers, and they would say, "Oh, you go to Trevico Creek, and they're there. You go to Harding Canyon, and they're there." And I never could find them, and I thought I just didn't know what I was doing. Like I could find everything else, but I could never find them, and so I never saw a red-legged frog growing up until I was, I think it was in college or maybe not even in college, maybe it was in grad school when I first actually started seeing them, and I didn't realize that I wasn't finding them because they were extinct, like they were locally absent from Southern California, because you could read stories from the 60s how common they were, and it was like, well, that's not that long ago, in the 80s it wasn't that long ago, but and so I've been intrigued by the red-leggeds for a long time, and for the last ones disappeared out of Southern California in like about 20 years ago. In about 2001 was the last individual frog that was in the Santa Ana Mountains that we know of, and so it's taken 20 years almost to bring them back. And so we've done the genetics, and we can show that the frogs that were in Southern California, they're most closely related to this frog that's in northern Baja California. So we had a grad student, Annie, who was on her thesis, and she was a student in La Paz, and she worked on the Mexican populations and where do they still occur in Baja, and what are their relatedness. And so we could show that genetically those were the closest match to Southern California, not getting frogs from further north. And then it's just taken a long time to be able to bring them in, but we've now got 2 places in Southern California where we brought in egg masses, and we have metamorphs on the landscape. So just last night, I had crews at both sites, and both sites, they saw 5 metamorphs,
nice.
Which, eggs to tadpoles to metamorphs. And so those metamorphs at one site are from egg masses we moved earlier this year. From the other site, we think those are bigger metamorphs. So we think those, or juveniles, those are from the egg masses we moved last year. So for the last 2 years, and we've got one site in San Diego, one in Riverside, and we're hoping to get some sites onboarded in Orange County soon as well to try to return this frog back into the landscape. And we think it really declined because of disease. And so we think it went through like a disease kind of purge when there was this fungus that affected amphibians, and then it might have really knocked out the red-leggeds. And then there's populations that exist, like the ones that we have now, have that disease, but it doesn't seem to affect them at all. We're not seeing any evidence of die-offs, and so they're kind of resistant to it if they're not stressed out, we think. Like if I think if you really stressed them out, then the disease might be able to the fungus might be able to impact them. But we're having really good success at moving these egg masses, and we're using a helicopter in Mexico from the mountaintop to get down towards the border, and then we're driving across. And the first move was right when we shut down everything for COVID, and so it was a lot of moving parts to get these things moved. But we've been super excited that it's been successful, and we have the species now at least present on the landscape at these 2 sites in Southern California. And it's really an impressive, gorgeous frog with the red underneath the legs and the modeling and stuff. And it'll be really interesting to see it back in Orange County with pond turtles, and, really have a few of these diagnostic sites where we've got, good recovery of some of these species. I think that'll be super exciting to highlight to people.
Yeah. Again, Pete, it's about biodiversity. It's about how the web of life and how all these things work together. And they're, they've historically done, integrated with each other. And so it's trying to bring some of that back and not losing that biodiversity, even as, the urbanization has changed and the climate has changed and all this kind of stuff. So it's, from a conservation land manager, I think it's super important.
Well, and it is for human health going forward as well. And so it's one of the things that we really focus a lot on is this link between aquatic invasives and emerging infectious diseases, and in particular on dengue fever, chikungunya, Zika virus. So I don't know if you've noticed this in Orange County, but you're now getting daytime mosquitoes that you didn't have before, right? So
I had 6 of them in my house today.
Yeah. So those mosquitoes, we being the state of California has been having an effort to keep those mosquitoes from coming into the state. And they're losing that battle. And as those mosquitoes come in, they're competent hosts for a whole bunch of diseases that affect us, that'll affect our health in Southern California. And so what we've done is we've been studying the relationship between those mosquitoes invasives and then invasive crayfish and then native dragonflies and then ultimately frogs to show that actually if you push these systems back, if you get rid of bullfrogs and crayfish, you can get dragonflies, and then the dragonflies are the most effective tool at keeping the mosquitoes out of some of these systems. And so that human health benefit from biodiversity is a real one in Southern California that you can see, and that's been that concern with the diseases basically at the border, these tropical diseases that are right there, right on the edge of California. They're gonna, once they start taking off and getting endemic in the landscape, it's going to be hard to deal with dengue everywhere and the 4 types of dengue fever and stuff. And it's going to be shocking to people. And it's going to have an economic impact, because who wants to come to California to get malaria when you can, to Southern California, you can go to the Bay Area and not get malaria. And so that's going to affect our tourism and other industries. And so that link between healthy systems and disease resiliency and human health benefits is actually a real one. We've been studying quite a bit with people at Pepperdine and people at UCLA, and I think it's going to be it's a better way to talk about some of these invasive control things, because people can resonate with that. Do you want crayfish and dengue fever, or do you want dragonflies and not be sick? So it's interesting. But and then ultimately we get red-leggeds out of that win as well.
Yep. It's always interesting, like how you get the funding and how you get the pathway. It's not always a straight line.
No. And what resonates with politicians in particular is really what people are experiencing in their daily lives. And so tracking that, I think, is really important to make sure you can help mitigate what people are struggling with as much as you can.
Yeah.
I'd like to not struggle with any of the dengue fevers.
Me neither. I don't want Zika. Yeah, no, I agree.
Right. But we are building our own mountain lion sanctuary here in the front yard. I've got a goat chained to a tree, and I actually had 10-foot pikes with fish bowls on top with the bass in there. But I guess I can just go get a half-dead cow. And
yeah.
So I'm looking for a zombie cow.
Yeah. Robert, just so you know, I brought Winston Vickers on with Pete, so he got a really good, hour-long, in-depth look into Southern California mountain lions, which was really good.
Yeah, Winston's a great guy. Yeah.
And I love what Winston was talking about because we do have. I'm from the northern part of the state, up in the Bay, and as a kid, I remember we had a big cat that would roam around the hills literally behind my house, and now we have turkeys and we have, goats everywhere. If you raise goats, a goat's going to get, there's all kinds of things that are fox and all kinds of stuff. So there's going to be big cats, and we have to understand, what they do and what the threat actually is, because a big cat is terrifying. But for the most part, they don't really want to do with, humans are scary to them. They want to stay away for the most part. And so I think it's important that we understand these things. We understand the importance of frogs. It's easy. It drives me crazy when these farmers talk about the water wars and they're like, it's a 3-inch fish. Like, yeah, so what? Like, the size of it doesn't matter, especially if, if
it plays a role in this.
I know, it's got a job. It's got a job. Don't body shame it. Have a better argument than the size of the thing. So I love that we're talking about this, and you're right. Like, dengue fever is a real problem. I mean, we don't want to have to deal with any kind of malaria and all those things. So listen, I appreciate you coming on the show, Dave. It's always awesome. Let's get the Eagle guy on the show at some point. And I dig what you're doing, Robert. And I appreciate you. And look, not enough people say this to you. Thank you from all of us out here in humanity. Thank you for doing what you do. And thank you for being so interesting and fun and fascinating about it.
No, thanks for inviting me on. I appreciate talking to you guys and escaping from the fiscal closeout of the government.
Yeah. Isn't that where we all end up, right?
Yeah. And whether or not the government's going to be shut down in 2 weeks, all that stuff. Yeah, that's my life. Oh, yeah.
I was doing finance and accounting today too. So, Robert, I totally appreciate you coming on and accepting the invitation. I always enjoy talking to you. It's always fun. I'm glad we still get to work together after years
so many years.
Yeah.
Seriously.
All right, let me wrap this thing up. Stand by, you guys.
Thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much.